All right, you saw it in the markets today with commodities and industrials rallying. It's a story that, quite frankly, the whole world is talking about, the fear of inflation. Wall Street Journal, just one of the big papers touching on it. Commodity prices have been on a total tear for some time. Food, copper, coal, oil, gold, cotton, you name it. They are skyrocketing. So how ominous is the threat of inflation, really? And is it going to destroy our soaring stock market and our recovering economy? Well, here now to debate is Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, radio host and author of How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, and Dan Greenhouse, chief economic strategist, Miller Tabak. Peter Schiff, of all people, from a central banker. We heard it from Jean-Claude Trichet. Inflation really is a problem. Do you agree with him?
Well, sure, the central bankers ought to know. They're the ones that create it. You know, the economy isn't really recovering. And yes, stock prices are rising for the same reason that commodity prices are rising. Prices rise as a consequence of inflation. The rising prices aren't the inflation. The quantitative easing is the inflation. It's expanding the money supply. Central banks are doing that all around the world, so it's not a coincidence that prices are rising. And it's not because of the weather, and it's not because of speculators. That's what governments like to blame inflation on. But the real cause is the government itself running big deficits and having their central banker friends monetize it.
So, Dan Greenhouse, you look at these numbers. CRB commodity index for food, already up 7% year to date, up 34% last 52 weeks. Commodity index for raw materials up about 25%. Gold up 22%. How serious is this, Dan? Peter Schiff says it's quite serious. What is your position?
Well, Peter Schiff, with all due respect, has an argument that's fundamentally wrong right now. He, like many people, asserts that the increase in the money supply is what's driving the increase in commodity prices. However, if you take a look at the money supply, the trend line going back from the start of the decade until the day before Lehman collapsed, we are effectively at this moment right where we should have been had September 2008 not happened. So while the money supply might not be going up fast enough for you, it doesn't change the fact that the money supply is exactly where it should be. The Fed has not expanded the money supply.
Sure. Where do you think it's getting all the money to buy all these bonds?
The money supply is going up, is exactly the point that it is at, is exactly where it would have been had the pre-Lehman trend continued.
Well, sure, and the pre-Lehman trend was inflationary. You remember where commodity prices were in 2008? They're still lower than they were then. They were going off the charts. Oil was $150 a barrel. Some of the commodity prices were a lot higher than they are right now because all the inflation that the Fed was creating prior to that. But here's the big difference right now. We've been exporting our inflation all around the world, particularly to countries like China. They are choking on it right now. Prices are rising rapidly. They have had enough.
And what they have to do, rising rapidly.
In China, sure they are. Take a look. And also in Latin America. And what the Chinese are going to realize is that they have to stop importing our inflation. They're going to let their currency rise sharply. That will bring prices down in China, and that will send them soaring here in the United States.
Their currency should rise, Peter.
Yes.
Their currency should rise.
And when their currency rises, our currency is falling. So prices are falling for the Chinese, and they're going to be rising for us. And when the Chinese stop buying our paper, they also stop buying our treasuries. So interest rates rise, commodity prices, consumer prices rise. And then the Fed's going to be in a real box because it's going to have to get very aggressive on interest rates when the recession is worsening.
You know, Dan Greenhouse, let me just insert one point. A lot of people, myself included, believe that gold and commodities are themselves indicators, in fact, leading indicators of higher future inflation, that it's the market's way of signaling there's too much money circulating either now or in the future. Could that be the issue, that it may not show up in the CPI, but it's coming down the road, these market price indicators?
Well, listen, at the start of a recovery, economically sensitive commodities should go up in price. That's what we have seen, that's what we are seeing, and that's what we're going to see. But to be clear, commodities are not, quote-unquote, inflation. And inflation as measured by the government, and I know Peter's going to have a problem, some of it correct, with the CPI, the PCE, inflation as what the Fed cares about has been going backwards down the number line for the better part of 2 years now. And while that's clearly going to bottom and move higher, it's important to remember that commodities and increases in commodities are not, quote-unquote, inflation.
The Fed doesn't really care about the actual rate of inflation. The Fed is trying to use these phony government numbers as cover to keep creating inflation, which is what the Fed wants to do because it wants to bail out the politicians in Washington who want to keep on deficit spending.
Well,
if we had any central banker with integrity, he would be raising interest rates and forcing the government to cut spending, because we're never going to have a recovery. What we're doing now is we're spending more borrowed money, and as we're spending ourselves deeper into debt, we're pretending the economy is growing. It's not. We can't really grow the economy until we shrink the government.
Peter, nowhere in the Fed's mandate is it required to facilitate or prevent government spending. I agree with you that there's a problem on the fiscal side of things, but it's not the Fed's job to get in the way of that.
Well, no, yes, it is. I mean, the reason we have an independent central bank instead of the Federal Reserve being an arm of the Treasury is so the politicians can't have their debt monetized. They're supposed to take the punch bowl away. They should be tightening. They shouldn't be worrying about the fiscal about the consequences.
Peter, let me ask you. It's interesting.
Wait, let me just quickly add one more quick thing, Larry. We quote unquote tightened in the summer and the fall of 2008 when this same I feel the feeling I forgot from that time, because the CRB was going straight up, oil was at 140, and the Fed paused, and the second half of 2008 was atrocious in part because the Fed tightened implicitly.
No, it was atrocious because the Fed was too easy in the years leading up to it.
The falling commodity prices tells us the Fed was not loose enough.
No, they were too loose from 2001 all the way to 2007. It was that cheap money that inflated that housing bubble. It's the reason that everything went up.
Just the last one.
Look, the Fed shouldn't have given up.
I need a yes or no on the way up. Inflation is creeping up in Europe. Inflation is definitely rising in Asia and Latin America. Yes or no, Dan Greenhouse? In the next 12 months, will inflation rise in the USA?
1,000%.
It will rise 1,000%?
No. Well, I'm not trying to quote Peter Schiff here. 1,000%. The CPI will end the year higher than where it is today.
All right, Peter Schiff, you're going to agree. How much higher, Pete?
I don't know what the CPI is going to show by the end of the year. It'll definitely be a much bigger number than 2010. But, you know, inflation's already there. We're just waiting for the consequences of it. And the consequences are rising prices. And as I said, we've been exporting this inflation all around the world. Everybody's going to re-export it back to us. We're going to have to eat this inflation. There's a lot of money out there. And when it comes back, you know, there's not that much stuff to buy. And so prices go way up.
All right. Gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Peter Schiff and Dan Greenhouse, thanks very much. Coming up, it's the big debate in Washington. Erupting the day before President Obama delivers the State of the Union speech, is the president relapsing back to a partisan big government spending? Oh, my Lord. Just when I thought the era of big government was over. We'll have some new details that'll either make you a believer or not.